Okay, well, good evening again to folks in the room and folks hopefully online with my technological limited skills. Hopefully we did it right so that I'm actually coming through. We're going to look tonight at Daniel, which is an interesting book in more ways than one. It is listed among the major prophets in our Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, it is actually part of what's called the writings. In the Hebrew Bible, there's three sections: the law, the prophets, and the writings. The law, obviously, is not only the first 5 books, the Torah, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but also those books that are the history of the early Joshua and Judges and the books of Kings. Then the prophets are the major and minor prophets that we've been talking about. And then the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, etc. Those kind of ways. So the Hebrew Bible is divided into those 3 areas. The Hebrew Bible puts Daniel in the writings, whereas for Protestants at least, it's considered part of the prophets. Why is that? Because Daniel, I don't know if any of you all have ever read past the famous stories. You know, the famous stories in Daniel are Daniel in the lion's den, the fiery furnace. Those are the ones that everybody knows in the book of Daniel. Those stories are the first half of Daniel, the first 6 chapters. Chapters 7 through 12 are a whole different ballgame. Chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel read more like the book of Revelation. That's the kind of imagery you see in Daniel 7 through 12. It's imagery that's very reminiscent of what you read in the book of Revelation. Lots of visions of weird creatures and animals that have the head of one animal and the body of another animal, and numerology and symbolism and mysterious things. And when we get, we'll talk about the first half, the familiar part, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on those 7 through 12 and talk about the imagery and why the end of Daniel, those last 6 chapters of Daniel, are so familiar in terms of thematically and style to the book of Revelation, which of course itself is the most confusing and I would say misunderstood and abused book in the Bible in terms of how it is used and abused. So, but first, for those in the room, and I apologize for those online, you don't have this in front of you, but it's a little cartoon version that I've used the past few weeks that gives you a sense of the flow of Daniel. And in the cartoon, I'll describe it a little bit to folks online. It talks about the 12 chapters, and since it is only 12 chapters, each chapter kind of has its own little box here. How it begins with the captives taken to Babylon, including Daniel and his 3 friends, and how they are put into the service of the Babylonian kingdom. Then we have in chapter 2 the king's dream. In chapter 3 the fiery furnace. We'll look at all that. In chapter 4 Nebuchadnezzar and his pride. Then we shift to Belshazzar and what happened at the banquet of Belshazzar. Then the lion's den in chapter 6. And that's the stories that we're most familiar with. Then we get to Daniel's visions or dreams, and we get into all kinds of very mysterious visions about creatures and mysterious prophecies and things like that. I won't even try to go through all that. And when we get to those 6 chapters, we will say, well, what does this mean, and how do we compare this to the book of Revelation? So hang on to that. The other thing you'll notice, and if you look at the bottom of this cartoon sheet, it mentions that chapter 1 of Daniel is written in Hebrew, chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, and chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. This is what one of the few places in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that is not Hebrew, that is Aramaic. Now, I've mentioned before that the relationship between Hebrew and Aramaic, for me, the best analogy is the relationship between Latin and Italian. And if you've ever looked at those two languages, you know that Latin is the basis for all the Romance languages, for Italian and French and Spanish, etc. But most people don't speak Latin anymore. That was the language of the Roman Empire, but almost no country, people are not fluent in Latin anymore. Latin evolves into Italian and the other languages. Hebrew was the sacred language of Israel. And as language evolves, it evolved into a sort of a dialect of Hebrew called Aramaic. If you look at the different, what's called Semitic languages, and not to get too deep into this, but languages are in families. When we think about, if you speak English like we do, and you look at Spanish, French, German, Italian, etc., you recognize patterns and words that are derived from each other. Some words in those languages are very familiar because they sound like our version of the word, and sometimes it's even the exact same word. Those are Romance languages, and of course English is this conglomeration of Romance languages and old Anglo-Saxon words that come, from some of them from Scandinavian areas, etc., etc. Well, when you talk about the Middle East, when you talk about the languages of the Middle East, and you talk about Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic and other languages, those are called Semitic languages. And there's other family of languages like in Asia, Chinese and Japanese, etc., that are another family of languages. So the earth has these different family of languages. That's why if you compare like Hebrew and Arabic, and I barely speak any Hebrew and I don't speak any Arabic, but the word in Hebrew for peace is shalom, right? The word for peace in Arabic is salam. So you see they are, they're cousins there. And if you compare the Hebrew language and the Arabic language, you'll see many of those same similarities. All that to say, why are chapters 2 through 7 in Daniel written in Aramaic instead of being written in Hebrew? The only real answer we have is we don't know. As we talk about this book, there's going to be a great deal of disagreement among scholars as to when it was written. Daniel lives during the period of the exile, from the Hebrew exile in Babylon. Remember, Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians in 586. That exile lasts 70-ish years. So it goes from the 586 into the next century. That's the timeline. Many scholars believe that this was actually written down in the 2nd century BC. Written down somewhere around the year 170 BC, 180 BC is when it was actually written down. And we'll talk about why scholars think that. Why some of it was written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew, because this book was probably pieced together from different traditions and different stories that get passed down and finally written down. But, for those of us who are reading it in English, it's not that noticeable. But it is unusual that there's only a couple of other places in the Bible where it switches to Aramaic. But this is the main place that happens. So, anyway, having said all that, and we can come back to that, and if you want to look at that later, study that later, it'll be helpful. Let's look at Daniel. Because we've been talking about, of course, this timeline of the northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes that are conquered by Assyria, 722 BC. That happens. They almost get Judea, but they don't. Judea remains still on the sort of on the knife's edge of being conquered or invaded, but they hold steady until 586, when finally Nebuchadnezzar and the army of Babylon break down the walls of Jerusalem, tear down the temple, take the Jewish people into captivity in Babylon. And it's not an overnight thing. It happens over several years of the captivity and the transporting of slaves from Judea to Babylon, which remember is Iraq. And we believe at least we know, that what Babylon often did was they would take the best, the finest specimens from the wealthy families that they thought would make the best slaves and the best workers. And that would be their way of who they would bring into slavery in Babylon. And that's how this book begins, that Daniel and his 3 friends are 4 of the young men who were taken from Judea into captivity in Babylon. And they come from good families. They come from high, some of the aristocratic families of Judea. They're young, strong, healthy young men that the Babylonians say, these are the kind of workers we need. So that's where we start in Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, remember he's the last king, the one who gets they murder his sons, then poke out his eyes and take him into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. So when they tear down the temple, of course they don't just tear it down. The temple is full of all kinds of gold and silver and bronze and beautiful furnishings. That stuff all gets carted back to Babylon. The priceless part, the precious part, all gets carted off to Babylon. These they carried off the temple to his God in Babylonia and put up the treasure house of his God. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's conquering of Judea. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility of Judea. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So these are the ones they've chosen, not for grunt labor, not for, construction. These are the young men that they want to train for, we would call the civil service. To work in the palace, to work in jobs that require more intellect, more training, more skill, more refinement. These are the cream of the crop of the young men of Judea that are brought in to be palace workers. Okay? So, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. In other words, the good stuff, the good food, the rich food. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So they give them Babylonian names. And this happens again in almost any forced relocation of slavery. We know that happened when slaves were brought here from Africa. They did not keep their African names. They were given English names. If you remember, some of you may remember the old Roots, the TV series, the main character in that, Kunta Kinte. He doesn't keep his name, Kunta Kinte. They call him Toby. So that's the same thing's happening here. The Jewish slaves are given Babylonian names. And these names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are names that have within them the name of the Babylonian gods. Just like the Jewish names often have the name of Yahweh. But these names have the names of the Babylonian gods. So, they bring them in, they change their names, and they start feeding them the good food. Not what the guys working on the construction projects are getting, but the good stuff from the king's table. But there's a problem with that. What would be the problem for that? It's not kosher. It's not kosher. And so it says, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So, please don't make us eat non-kosher food. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king will then have my head because of you. If you show up all scrawny, it's my fault and it's my head if you don't eat the good food. But Daniel says to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over them, verse 12, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So, you just let us eat water and vegetables, and y'all eat the rich stuff, and then see if we really start to look scrawny and puny. And he's like, all right, 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their food, choice food, and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. And so, if you think, okay, this is the biblical endorsement of being a vegetarian, I guess you could read it that way. But it had nothing to do with that. It had all to do with being kosher. It's only about being kosher. None of the Babylonian food, except for the vegetables, was acceptable to Jews. And so they asked it to eat something else and drink something else that would be kosher. And, they ended up being healthy and strong. Just like, I brought a bottle of water and then I left it. And I don't think I can get through the whole thing without some water.
Where'd you? I'll get you one.
Would you mind bringing me a cup of water? Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
So they look healthier than all the other young men who were brought in from other places. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams. We're in 1:17-18. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked to them. He found none equal to the 4. They entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is spoiler alert here. They're giving away the fact. Daniel, from the time he enters the service of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he's there in the court all the way through the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia. Do the math, that means that he served in the court 66 years. So, he's brought there as a young man, maybe, they may be 15, 16, 17-year-olds. They're brought in to serve. By the time Daniel reaches the end of his time service under these kings, various kings, he's got to be 80 years old. Which, again, when we get to the lion's den story, I don't know if you've ever pictured it in your mind, but when they throw Daniel to the lion's den, they're throwing an 80-year-old man to the lions. Okay? Because that's when that story takes place. So he's not, probably in Bible, thank you very much. Probably in Bible picture books, he's not pictured that old, my guess would be in a lot of them. But you just do the math, by the time of Cyrus, he's an old man. Thank you. So we got our 4 major characters there in Babylon. Now, Daniel has a gift that is similar to Joseph, the gift of interpreting dreams. The gift of interpreting dreams. So, this story is funny because of how the reaction. In chapter 2, the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind is troubled and he couldn't sleep. Again, this is similar to what happens in Genesis. Remember? When the Pharaoh's having the dreams and he can't figure them out and he can't sleep. He's troubled by these dreams. And well, this is a similar situation. Nebuchadnezzar's having these dreams and they're bothering him. So he summoned his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. He's got all kinds of flunky, supposedly wise men. They're working for him, who are practicers of divination and astrology and other kinds of, magic, and which, of course, in a lot of them, it's all a show. But these are his men who he calls in for wisdom. So he calls the guys in. They came in and stood over thinking. He said to them, "I've had a dream that troubles me. I want to know what it means." Okay. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic. This is when it switches from Hebrew to Aramaic, right at that verse. "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret it." Okay, tell us what you dreamed. And that sounds like Genesis with Joseph. All right, tell me your dream, and I'll tell you what it means. Well, I have these 7 cows and all this stuff, right? The king replied, "This is what I firmly decided. If you don't tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll have you cut into pieces and your house is turned into piles of rubble. If you tell me the dream and explain it, you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it." In other words, I had a dream. You tell me what I dreamed. And then tell me what it means. I had a dream. You tell me what I dreamed. Because you're these magic guys. You're these magicians. And you tell me what I dreamed and interpret it. And I will give you great rewards. And if you don't, I'm going to chop you to pieces. Once more they read, "Let the king tell his servants the dream and we'll interpret it." Yeah, okay, you tell us what you dreamed and we'll interpret it. The king answered, "I'm certain you're trying to gain time. You're stalling. Because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you don't tell me the dream, there's just one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I'll know that you can interpret it for me. You're supposed to be in contact with the gods, the spirits, or whatever. Tell me what I dreamed." And I just think this is the response to verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, "There's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. And they don't live among men." Like, you are asking for the impossible. Tell us the dream, and then we'll interpret it. We can't tell you what you dreamed. This made the king so angry and furious, he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends and put them to death, because they are also now advisors in the courtiers. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch explained the matter to Daniel. This Daniel went into the king and asked for time, so that he might interpret the dream for him. Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. He and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Praises God, and there's a prayer where he prays, this sort of a psalm of praising God for giving them wisdom and revealing things to them. And then it says, he went into Arioch whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, said to him, "Don't execute the wise men. Take me to the king, and I'll interpret the dream for him." So Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, "I found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means." So the king asked Daniel, remember that the king has given him the name Belshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mysteries asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these." And then he begins to reveal this dream. "As you're lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron. Its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay," from which we get the expression feet of clay. Each person has feet of clay. "While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on the threshing floor of the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he's made you ruler over them. You are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partially of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not of human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Now, of course, this has led folks for, centuries and centuries to go, all right, what are these kingdoms? There is more than one theory about this. The most common theory is that gold is Babylon. The next one, iron, is the Medes and the Persians that conquered Babylon. The one after that is Greece under Alexander the Great. And the one after that is Rome. But these are the four kingdoms. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. And that the rock that destroys them all is God. That the kingdom of God will bring them all low. Now, that is the most, popular interpretation. And some of that depends on how much, what you believe about when this was written, how much of it you believe was written either in the time of Daniel or in the 2nd century, and whether you count the Medes and the Persians as one level. Some have it as Babylon, Medes, Persian, Greece, and say it did not predict Rome. Most interpretations have it as Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, Rome as the 4 levels. The 4 succeeding kingdoms, because that is, of course, the course of history. We know the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. We know the Persians are conquered by the Greeks, and we know eventually the Roman Empire dominates all. But again, there's not just one understanding or interpretation of that, but that is the most common one. So that image of you're the gold, but eventually there'll be other kingdoms to follow you. Verse 46, King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel, paid him honor, and ordered that an offering of incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. So Nebuchadnezzar, who of course worships all these Babylonian gods, here says, your God, Yahweh, is the top God, the God of gods. Remember, he's not saying he's the only God. He's just willing to say he's the most powerful of the gods. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all the wise men. So he puts him in a sort of almost a prime minister type position because of this. At least over all the advisors, the wise men and soothsayers and others who use their astrology and etc. to try to advise the king. So, it's unclear when he says, tell me what I dreamed. Is he testing them, or can he himself really not remember what he dreamed? I had this dream and I can't quite remember it. Tell me what I dreamed. Because there's times, that happens to me. I'm in the middle of a dream and I wake up and it vanishes. It just is like smoke. It's just gone in a matter of seconds. I can't hold on to it. Anyway, so Daniel gets lifted up to a high position, and we say, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, he's acknowledging the power of Daniel's God, the God of the Jews. But he's not, we wouldn't call him convert by any means. Now, the 3rd chapter contains maybe the most famous story in this book. And I'm not going to read every word because there's a lot of duplication and repetition in it. But Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 makes a giant statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide of himself. 90 feet, okay, think of it basically a 9-story building. If you think 10 feet per story, a 90-foot statue, that's a pretty big statue, a 9-story statue. And he summons, and here's where, in these storytelling, often these lists, he summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other officials to come and to the dedication that he set up. So, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates. This is repeated over and over, the list every time, which is Middle Eastern storytelling of that list, is just repeated over and over. It's that sense of repetition that gives the story a certain, it's like you said, and then everybody went, and you list everybody who went, and then you list them again, and you list them again, and that's the way this story goes. And so, they say to the crowd, to the gathered crowd, O peoples, this is verse 4, nation of men in every language, as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, You must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace, or in some translations, a fiery furnace. So, and then verse 7, you see this repetition that, therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, etc., they all fell down and worshipped the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then some astrologers, some of the wise men, who are some of these court advisors, they come and denounce the Jews. Verse 9. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, they could just say music, but that's not the style of the Hebrew writing. Is supposed to fall down and worship. And whoever doesn't do that will be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up. There's 3 of these Jewish kids who were not bowing down. So they summon them in. Here we get verse 14. He says, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods or the image? Now, when you hear the sound of horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp. If you're ready to fall down and worship, very good. If you don't worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then, what God will be able to rescue that from my hand? So, of course, this sets up, these young men have been carted away from their homeland. They've been taught the Babylonian language. They've been given Babylonian names. They've been taught Babylonian history. They have been indoctrinated into the culture of Babylon. They work for the Babylonian king in his own palace. Are they going to fall in line and do what is expected of every other good Babylonian? No, they're not. They're not going to worship an idol. Because think about what brought them to this place. Think about all the things that the prophets have been saying in all these other weeks. What is the main problem that the Jews kept falling into over and over and over again? Idolatry. Idolatry. And here we see, as I said, now that God has finally brought the hammer down, we see symbolically in these young men, even under threat of death, they are not going to commit idolatry. They're not going to worship an idol, even one that's 90 feet high. So, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. And he'll rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, I want you to know, O king, we won't serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. Our God can rescue us, and he may or may not do that. We may all die, but, live or die, we're not going to do that. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. His attitude toward them changed. Because, they'd been sort of the golden boys here they gave the best advice. Remember it said they were 10 times better than the other astrologers, wise men, and poobahs that were serving there in the palace. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these three men firmly tied fell into the blazing surface. So it's so hot, the guys throwing them in get burned up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king. Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Again, how do we understand that? How the Jews see it, how Christians see it, how we see it, depends a lot on perspective. For a lot of Christians, they would say, it looks like the Son of God, that Jesus is there in the fire, the Son. This is before his incarnation, but this is the Son. Or others say an angel. Or in some ways, there is a 4th person in the furnace, and they are unharmed. So, who the 4th person is sent obviously by God. The identity of the 4th person varies on how we interpret that passage. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So they came out, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. They didn't even smell like smoke. So Nebuchadnezzar then changes his tune at that point. "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut to pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." And he promotes them. So, again, he is impressed with the God of the Jewish exiles, that they could protect his people in that way. The fourth chapter is a dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm not going to read all of it, but it's a letter that he writes describing his dream. He talks about how he's in his home, was lying in his bed, he saw visions, he brought in the wise men. Verse 7, he brings in all the astrologers and magicians, etc. They don't know what it means. He brings in Daniel, who he knows can do it. And then there's a little parenthetical comment at the end of chapter verse 8, 4:8. He's called Belshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods in him. Remember, Belshazzar is, here's a little note that explains it. Names, a little note in my Bible, names were extremely important in biblical times. They conveyed something of a person's identity. God sometimes gave a person a new name to indicate a changed life. However, the name the Babylonians presented to Daniel, Belteshazzar, was no gift from God. It was taken from Bel, a title for the Babylonian god Marduk. Daniel was surrounded by an alien culture and couldn't avoid every aspect of it. So his name has the name of a Babylonian god, Bel, as part of his name. He says, I, Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know the spirit of the God. There's no mystery. So here's the dream I had. He tells Daniel the dream. Verse 10. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong. Its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful. Its fruit abundant. under it. The beasts of the field found shelter. The birds of the air lived in it. So it's this great tree. While I was laying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger. Or in some translations, a watchman. A holy one coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off the branches. And okay. Let the stump and the roots remain. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and live with the animals. Let his mind be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the mind of an animal. And that this is so that the holy ones would know that the Most High is sovereign. This is the dream that I, Nebuchadnezzar, had. He says, now Belshazzar, tell me what it means. So, verse 19, Daniel, also called Belshazzar, says, well, go ahead, he says, Daniel was perplexed, his thoughts terrified him. And the king says, well, don't let it alarm you. And Daniel replies, my lord, if only this dream applied to your enemies, and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, beautiful, visible to the whole earth, beautiful leaves, abundant fruit, right, good for all, shelter, blah, 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 blah. You, king, verse 22, you're that tree. You become great and strong. Your greatness has grown. Your dominion extends. You, king, verse 23, saw a messenger saying, cut down that tree. Leave the stump. Let it be drenched with dew. Let him live like a wild animal. This is the interpretation, 24. This is the decree of the Most High. You will be driven away from people and live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command is to leave the stump with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins. Do what's right in your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that your prosperity will continue. Well, and nothing happens immediately, but we're told a year later, as the king was walking by his palace, he said, verse 30, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? And then a voice said, this is what's been decreed, Nebuchadnezzar. Your authority will be taken from you. You'll be driven away from people. Live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle, etc. It's fulfilled. And it says then, that's what happened. Basically, he loses his mind. It says, verse 33, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He's driven away from people, ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven. His hair grew like feathers of an eagle. His nails like the claws of a bird. We would say he snapped. He went into a period of where he was delusional, where he was, not in his right mind. And it says that went on for 7 years. And then at the end of the 7 years, he restored his mind, and then he gives again honor to the King of Heaven, and seems to once again acknowledge that. Now, that's happened how many times at this point, where he's like, you're right, your God is sovereign, your God is the God of gods, your God is the God of kings, he's the great one, but then it didn't seem to stick very well. So that is where we see Nebuchadnezzar in all of this. Then we shift to his son, Belshazzar. So Nebuchadnezzar dies, his son Belshazzar becomes the king of Babylon. And here's where you're going to get another story that has a little phrase in our language that you will recognize. They're having a banquet. And it says, he brings in all the high muckety mucks, 5-2. Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring him the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. So, it would be analogous to, for us, somebody, a group of radicals break into the Vatican and get some of the stuff there and then use it in a satanic ritual. I mean, they take the goblets and the things that were used in the temple in Jerusalem, they're using it now to worship their gods, one of their banquets, worshiping Bel and Marduk and all that. So that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. They brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles and wives and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Hence the saying,
The writing on the wall.
the writing on the wall. The writing on the wall. The king called for his enchanters, astrologers, diviners, etc., and said, whoever can read this and tell me what it means. You get all these rewards, gold chains, and etc., etc. Verse 8, the wise men come in. They can't figure it out. They don't know what it means. And so, verse 9, King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face became even more pale. And then the queen, she says, don't be pale. Don't be. There's a man. Remember, there's a man here who can interpret these things. Verse 11, there's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man, Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, he's the one who can do it. He can solve these problems. Call for him. So they bring in Daniel. And, he says, I've heard you can interpret things. Yeah, I can do all that stuff through my God. I've heard you're able to interpret difficult problems. And if you can do so, I'll give you all these, He says, if you can read this reading, this is in 16. If you can read this right and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and you'll have a gold chain around your neck and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel says, you can keep your stuff. Keep your gifts. Give your rewards to somebody else. But I'll read the writing. He says, my God, verse 18, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. And, he had all this power. And he had the ability to, put anybody to death that he wanted. It says, but, verse 20, when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass. His body was drenched with dew until he acknowledged the Most High God is sovereign. Verse 22, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You have the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines, remember, which is harem girls, drank wine from them. You praised gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. So, because of all that, here's what the writing on the wall says. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. This is in Aramaic. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. So here's what it means. Mene, which means numbered. Numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Mene means number. Tekel means weighed, as in when you weigh something on the scales. Tekel means weighed. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres. It can mean divided, or it can also mean Persia. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So, the interpretation of the dream is Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Numbered, weighed, Persia were divided. At Belshazzar's command, Daniel was given the things that he was promised. That very night, Belshazzar, king of Babylon, king of the Babylonians, was slain. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, the Medes and the Persians, the Medes and the Persians are both what we would call Iran. The Medes are one area of what we would call Iran. The Persians are a different area of what we would call Iran. But together, the Medes and the Persians together conquer Babylon. And so, here we have a shift of power to now Darius the Mede. Darius the Mede. So in chapter 6, we're no longer under Babylonian control. We're under the control of the Medes. So we shifted now. Daniel is still kept on. He's still kept on as advisor, even now to a new regime. So it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps. These are like regional governors to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. So there's 100. Darius, divides the whole kingdom into 120 provinces, states, whatever. And those 120 governors report to 3 sort of super governors. And one of those super governors is Daniel, who by this time is an older man. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. What do the other administrators think of that? Yeah. Now, of course, in modern politics, there is no jealousy. Modern politics, you would never have one politician try to undermine another politician. Modern politics, you'd never have a politician sling mud or say nasty things about even somebody who worked in the same department as them to try and undermine them or get them fired so they could take their job. Luckily, none of those things would happen in modern society. We say over and over and over when you read the scriptures, things, customs change, clothes change, food changes, transportation changes, technology changes. All these things change radically. People are the same. People are the same. So, at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. There's a whole job that politicians have. You know what it's called? Opposition research. In other words, when, let's say during a presidential campaign, there's a whole group working for candidate A whose job is to dig up dirt on candidate B. And there's a whole group for candidate B whose whole job is to dig up dirt on candidate A. That is their full-time department job. Look for something, because you know what, in American politics, you know what wins elections? Negative ads. Negative ads are what win elections in America today. Just watch every election cycle. Watch the political ads. Is it about the good qualities of the candidate that they're wanting you to vote for? No. It's about how horrible your opponent is. So this is no different. They look for something that will get Daniel in trouble. Some inefficiency, some goof up, something he's done wrong. And they can't find anything. Middle of verse 4. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. We can't find anything he's done wrong. We've got to go after his religion. The only way we're going to be able to find anything, any dirt on him, is if we go after his religion. And again, I think that has been a part of politics ever before this and after this and up to the present day. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So, we think, O king, it would be really fun and nice and a great tribute to you if for a whole month the only person that can be prayed to is you. In the entire kingdom, the only person that can be worshipped is you. And what ruler or politician, when all of his staff says, "We think we should celebrate you for a month and make everybody worship you for a month." What a great idea. So, he agrees and puts it in writing. Verse 10, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before, for the last 60 plus years. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying. He prayed at certain times during the day. It was pretty easy to know when to catch him. They went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Didn't you publish a decree during the next 30 days that anyone who prays to any god or man except to you should be thrown in the lion's den?" "Yeah, I did." Yeah, I did. Verse 13. "Well, you know what, king? Daniel, who's one of those exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king. To any decree you put around, he prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. He didn't want, and Daniel's his right-hand man. Daniel is somebody he trusts. Daniel is a trusted advisor. But what would happen if he said, "Oh, well, I didn't mean it"? What's the expression, especially in other cultures? What would happen to him? He would lose face. Think about a similar example that doesn't turn out as well in the New Testament. When Herod, not Herod the Great, but his son, has John the Baptist arrested because he's married his sister-in-law, and John has been preaching about how it's wrong for him to marry his sister-in-law, stealing his brother's wife. John the Baptist has been saying this is wrong, and John gets thrown into jail, but Herod really likes going down and talking to him. He's fascinated by it. And he throws a drunken party, and his new wife's daughter, his stepdaughter, dances a harem dance for him. And he says, "What do you want as a reward, my dear? Anything you ask for." And she asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And he did not want to execute John the Baptist, but in front of all of his guests, if he said, oh, well, I didn't really mean it, he would lose face. And therefore he has to carry it out. So here, didn't you sign this order about the whole month is about worshiping you? Yeah? Well, guess who's not following your orders? Daniel. So that means he goes in the lion's den, right? Yeah. So, then for 15, it says, when is the group to the king? It said, remember, O king, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that the king's situation, Daniel's situation, might not be changed. The king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him. He couldn't sleep. What's going to happen to Daniel? He can't sleep all night. He can't eat. He can't sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel. He shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. No, I've never been disloyal to you. I've never done anything to wrong you. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he trusted in God. So the guy, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, no smoke on their clothes. Daniel, no claw marks, no little nips. At the king's command, the men who'd falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and their children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed them in all their bones. So, probably their plan did not turn out quite like they hoped. King Darius wrote to all the peoples this decree. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. He is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now Cyrus, if you remember, Cyrus is the one who is going to issue the decree that we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah that allows the Jewish exiles to leave Babylon and return back to Judea and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, what was usually called the Second Temple. Solomon's temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, and it lays there in ruins for 70 years. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, with the decree of Cyrus, king of the Persians, the Jews return to Judea. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild the walls. The temple they rebuild is not nearly as grand, not nearly as magnificent as Solomon's temple, because they don't have all the gold and the silver and the bronze and the cypress and the alabaster and marble and all the other things that were part of the first temple. As I've said before, when Herod the Great becomes the king of the Jews, he does an extensive building project to try to bring the temple back up to the magnificence that it had under Solomon, which is why they sometimes call it Herod's temple. So those first 6 chapters, we all I've heard those stories, heard about the fiery furnace, heard about the lion's den, maybe even heard about the statue with the 4 levels and the feet of clay and the handwriting on the wall and all those. We get to chapter 7 and everything just looks crazy. There is chapters 7 through 12 is a particular type of literature that is very prevalent among the Jews, and matter of fact, in all the Middle East, from about the 2nd century BC all the way through the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And there is a name for this type of literature. Apocalyptic. Apocalyptic literature. Our word apocalypse. Apocalyptic literature is the literature of Daniel 7 through 12 and the book of Revelation. And it is a particular style of writing, a particular type of literature that the problem with too many, this is, okay, my personal opinion. One of the problems with too many Christian pastors is they don't understand this at all. The only exposure to apocalyptic literature they have is Revelation and Daniel. They don't realize there's this whole genre of apocalyptic literature out there that was written during these hundreds of years. And they apply an approach to reading this material that is really not what it was intended, how it was intended to be read. I mean, without getting into too much detail, the book of Revelation, maybe it's easier for us to understand there. You read the book of Revelation, and if you've ever really tried to work your way through the book of Revelation, it can be real frustrating because of these images that are there that seem so weird and mysterious. And you think, what does all this mean? And there are writers and pastors and preachers who create this idea that it is a roadmap of the end of the world in terms of, well, there was a book that was published in the 70s called The Late Great Planet Earth. Anybody know what that was? It was by a fellow named Hal Lindsey. And Hal Lindsey wrote a book in the 70s called The Late Great Planet Earth, where he said, this is how you understand Daniel and Revelation. And he's like, okay, this, these horns, that's the European common market. And this army is China. And the mark of the beast is credit cards. And the beasts that have stinging tails and multiple wings, that's helicopters. And he took all these images from the book of Revelation and tried to say, this is how you read the contemporary world situation in the 1970s, and that's why Jesus' return is imminent. Well, Jesus didn't return in the 70s or the 80s, and eventually most of the ways that Hal Lindsey interpreted the book of Revelation as a roadmap for the end of the world that was going to happen right any time didn't come true. One of the featured characters in the book of Revelation is the Antichrist. And it says in the book of Revelation, he's the beast. The number of the beast is what? 666. Okay. And yet you didn't know that. Yeah, 666. And throughout history, in every generation, people have said, this is the Antichrist. Napoleon, Hitler, any world conqueror, anybody who seems to be striving for world dominion, that's got to be the Antichrist. Any evil ruler. And they do all kinds of numerology, like Ronald Reagan, Ronald Wilson Reagan, 6 letters in each name. All kinds of things like that. You can use numerology and almost make it, apply to anybody, if you twist the numbers around enough. A competent biblical scholar will say 666 is obviously Nero. It's very plain that it's Nero. And the book of Revelation is more about what was happening in the first century than it is about what's going to happen in the 21st century or the 23rd century or the 30th century or any other. The book of Revelation is written in code to talk about what was happening to the church right then. And every time it mentions Babylon in the book of Revelation, it's really talking about the Roman Empire. And when you read the book of Revelation and you understand the political situation of the first century Christians, you understand that this type of apocalyptic writing was a way to talk about what was happening in the current times using fantastic language and fantastic imagery. And that, the best example of that I read in the book, it's not original to me, and when I've taught Revelation, I always start with this analogy. When you imagine somebody who moves to the United States from a foreign country, and they're not familiar with American culture. And imagine that we still have these things called newspapers, which, we hardly have anymore. But imagine they open a newspaper, and they're on the back pages where there's an editorial, and they see a picture of an elephant fighting a donkey. And they would go, what in the world does this mean? Why is an elephant fighting a donkey? Why would there be a cartoon of an elephant and a donkey fighting or playing tug of war? What does this possibly mean? And we would go, well, it's about the Democrats and the Republicans, and they would have no clue about that the Democrats are a donkey and the Republicans are an elephant. And you've got to know what the symbols mean. Or in the 60s and 70s, there's a cartoon. There's a bear and an eagle having a confrontation. Why is the bear and the eagle having a confrontation? Well, because the bear is Russia and the eagle is the United States. If you know what the symbols mean, you can understand what the message is. But so many people, when they turn to the book of Revelation, don't know what was happening in the first century. And so they start saying, oh, this must be helicopters and credit cards, which it's not. And so way too many teachers and preachers try to impose an interpretation on apocalyptic literature that has to do nothing about the time it was written. It's a style of literature that I'm show my nerd quality here. Like Star Trek, there's a story. There's the original Star Trek, the William Shatner, Captain Kirk Star Trek. There's an episode where these two guys are fighting, and they're obviously aliens, and they have their face is divided, black on one side, white on the other side, and they hate each other, and they're trying to kill each other, and at the end of the episode of Star Trek, the crew of the Enterprise, well, why do you hate each other? Well, he's white on the left side and black on the right side. I'm black on the left side and white on the right side. It's not a story about aliens. It's a story in the 60s about racism. But they used science fiction to make a point about what it wasn't really happening in the 23rd century. It was happening in the 1960s. And the story was a parable about an issue that was happening right then. That's what the book of Revelation, and that's what the last 6 chapters of Daniel are more about. They're about what was happening then. Now, the main reason that most scholars believe that the second half of Daniel, at least, was written at a later time, not during the time of Daniel, was because of what happened in the 2nd century BC in Judea. You talk about the empires, okay? Babylon, Persia, Greece. Okay? Under the Greek Empire, started by Alexander the Great, etc., there was a movement to Hellenize the world. When I say Hellenize, the word for Greeks in Greek is Hellenos. So to Hellenize is to Greekify the world. Make Greek the language of the world, make Greek culture the culture of the world. There was a Syrian king named Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV. And he was determined to make the world Greek. He was particularly determined to make Israel and Judea Greek and to stamp out Judaism, to stamp out the Jewish religion. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus, God manifest. He called himself God. His detractors called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means crazy. And it's a play on words. He, during his time of invading Judea, went to the temple in Jerusalem and installed a statue and altar to Zeus in the Jewish temple. So most people, I'll put it this way, most scholars, when you turn all the way over to Daniel 11, it's talking about these kings, but it's talking about them sort of in code. Look at Daniel 11, let's start at like 29. It's talking about this ruler from the north. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him. He will lose heart. Then he'll turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He'll return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they'll set up the abomination that causes desolation. This is setting up the statue of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. When they fall, they'll receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it is still to come at an appointed time. The king will do as he pleases. He'll exalt and magnify himself above every god and say unheard of things against the God of gods. He'll be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what he has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. And on and on and on. Talking about this, most scholars who really understand the time and understand apocalyptic literature believe this is all referring to Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, what eventually is able to free the Jews from Antiochus Epiphanes? Here we have to turn to the Apocrypha and the story of the Maccabees. The Maccabees are Jewish revolutionaries in the 2nd century BC. The leader is Judah Maccabee. Maccabee means the hammer. Judah the hammer. And Judah Maccabee, Judah the hammer, leads a revolt against Antiochus and drives his forces out of Jerusalem. This is all in the book of Maccabees. That's part of the Apocrypha, those books that are in a Catholic Bible, but they're not in a Protestant Bible. They're not considered part of the canon of Scripture, the official wisdom. But the book of Maccabees tell of how Judah the Hammer, Judah Maccabee, led a revolt against the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, and drove them out of Jerusalem and got the statue of Zeus out of the temple, and then they had to purify the temple after it had been desecrated by the abomination that's mentioned there, abomination that causes desolation. It's mentioned there in chapter 31 of Daniel 11. So they have to purify the temple. And one of the things they have to do is burn the lamps in the temple. But the only way you can, those lamps, you can't just put any old oil in them. It has to be holy oil. And they don't have enough holy oil to keep the lamps burning. So they only have enough oil to keep them burning for a day. They light the lamps, and what happens? They burn for 8 days. Thus, the holiday called Hanukkah. And, you know, us Protestants, if we're like, where is that Hanukkah thing in the Bible? Well, it's not in our Bible because we don't have the Apocrypha. I mean, but we, of course, you can read the book of Maccabees. There's nothing wrong with reading the book of Maccabees. It's just that as they put the Hebrew Bible together, those books were from a later time, and they didn't make the cut. But that is the story, and so most scholars believe that what those last parts of Daniel, those prophecies, are all about what happened after Cyrus. They're prophecies about what happened after Cyrus with the rise of the Greeks and Alexander and the Antioch and all of that. That's what the prophetic parts of Daniel are about. And that's why a lot of scholars believe that the first 6 chapters were passed along orally for centuries. Those stories of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the stories of the fiery furnace and the lion's den and all those, and the 90-foot statue. Those are stories that were passed along and passed along and passed along. And then when it came to the 2nd century, they collected those stories, but they also added these apocalyptic stories that were referring to what was happening in the 2nd century. And that's really what you have. Now, what I'm just saying now, if you go to, not to, I'm trying to run somebody down. If you go to Rhema, they'll give you a totally different interpretation of all this. They're saying that all of the Daniel and Revelation is all about the end times. It's all about the end of the world. It's all about all the signs that are going to happen before the end of the world and the return of Jesus. And they take the book of Daniel and they take the book of Revelation and create these ginormous charts of all these events that are going to happen, and usually applying them to current events. The problem with that is every time they come up with a chart that is referring to current events change and make the chart no longer accurate, which is why that book that was published in the 70s that talks about the common market and all kinds of other things, it doesn't work anymore. And I'm not saying that there are not parts of, if you look back at the cartoon here, where it says, look at this little thing here, where it says, what does all this refer to? Explanation 1. Exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. Or, Roman Empire's destruction of the Jerusalem in 70 AD. Or, events yet to happen when Jesus returns. Which of those is the answer to Daniel 7 through 12? Is it about Antiochus? Is it about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? Is it about the future? And then the answer of this cartoon is, in a sense, they're all right. It says, the book offers hope to all future generations. Jesus used Daniel to describe Jerusalem's leaders. And John, author of Revelation, adapted Daniel to describe Rome and all future empires. So, in other words, the message, let's say, of Revelation is not only about Nero. It's also about any time God's people come under persecution. Anytime, God's people come under a persecution, and what that is like, and how God's people persevere under persecution, and the reality of evil leaders that is a constant in the history of the world. There's always going to be evil men and women who thirst for power, who declare themselves gods. Maybe they don't use that word, but who see themselves as world rulers, and who oppose God's people in their thirst for total domination of the world. And you can see why people like Napoleon or Hitler or whoever, think of world despots, Stalin, anyone you can name, and you can see how people of any generation might say, that guy's the Antichrist. But if you read the Bible, sometimes it uses the word Antichrist not just to describe a single individual. Sometimes it's really describing anyone who is actively opposing God and God's people. Now, you've heard me talk about one of my heroes is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor during World War II, who stood up to the Nazis and operated an underground church and an underground seminary. He really thought that Hitler was a fulfillment of the Antichrist. He saw Hitler's goal in life was to destroy the Jews. He saw in Hitler an image of Antichrist. Now he wouldn't buy into a lot of this, but he felt as a Christian that a way to rid the earth of Hitler was a worthy goal. But throwing around the word Antichrist is pretty well. Again, one of my other heroes is Martin Luther. Martin Luther called the Pope the Antichrist because of what he saw, the corruption in the Roman Catholic Church. Anyway, I'm sorry I didn't go into more detail with those last parts, but to try to dig into verse by verse those last parts of Daniel requires so much history and background, and it all really boils down to how did the Jews continue to survive under one persecution, one empire after another. There's only very brief periods of time that the Jews have ever been not under the thumb of some other empire. Whether it's Babylon or Persia or Greece or Rome or whoever. And of course, we know Rome finally destroys this second temple in 70 AD. Rome comes in and destroys Jerusalem yet again and destroys the temple yet again. And that's why there's no temple there today. That it was destroyed by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago. So, well, I'm almost 4 minutes over time. So, next week is our last one. We're going to look at Ezekiel. And give you one hint. There's a song that comes from Ezekiel.